wasn't completed in the first year of the legislative biennium, and the second was to begin laying the groundwork for 2021. So we're already thinking again of that 2-year cycle that begins again in January of 2021. And we made progress on everything, whether it was finishing something up or laying the groundwork and continuing our work. But our advocacy as a whole continued to progress items forward. For the 2020 legislative session, we focused on economic development tools for Lakewood Landing, securing funding for a multimodal transportation study, and laid the groundwork for capital funding requests for Fort Steilacoom Park improvements and Wards Lake Park expansion. Shelley is now going to go through each of these priorities in detail, and then I will wrap us up. So I'm turning it back over to Shelley.
All right. Well, thanks, Brianna. So the first item on the city's legislative agenda is economic development tools for Lakewood Landing. Since the biggest challenge to redevelopment of Lakewood Landing is the relocation of the WashDOT maintenance facility, we've been looking specifically for tools to finance the construction of a new WashDOT facility at an alternative location. And those tools are, two of the tools that we looked at are local revitalization financing, or LRF, and tax increment financing, or TIF. These types of tools have been challenging to secure under the former Speaker of the House, but with the changes in leadership in the House this past year, we felt that 2020 was an excellent opportunity to pursue these two options in particular. So the first, local revitalization financing, it's a program that was initially created in 2009, but is no longer providing new awards to local governments because the state contribution is maxed out. We worked with Representative Davina Dewar to introduce House Bill 2804, which would allow for new LRF awards up to $1 million for 20 years, with a maximum state contribution of $15 million. So up to 15, potentially 15 communities would have received $1 million award for 20 years. So Representative Dewar still serves on the Bothell City Council, and Bothell was previously a recipient of this similar type of financing award, which they used to redevelop their downtown. So she really understands the importance of this type of financing tool. This was also a priority for Association of Washington Cities, and Lakewood was one of the cities that was heavily engaged in advancing the bill. As originally drafted, construction of a state facility was not an eligible use for the awards, so it would not have helped with the relocation of the WashDOT facility. So we worked with Representative Steve Kirby to amend the bill on the House floor to include language that expanded the definition of allowable use to include construction of a state facility. With that amendment, the bill passed the House with strong bipartisan support. It was 94-3 and had a hearing in the Senate Ways and Means Committee the last week of session. There were concerns from Ways and Means Committee members about allocating $15 million to a program for 20 years, especially in light of what was then the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak in Washington. The second tool, which would have authorized true tax increment financing, also requires a constitutional amendment. So House Bill 2778 and House Joint Resolution 4212 were introduced and had a public hearing where Lakewood testified in support. They were voted out of the House Finance Committee, but died early in the session. So despite no bills passing the legislature this year, we made significant progress in advancing this discussion. And this is something that we're going to continue to work on over the interim months in preparation for the 2021 session. The next item on the city's agenda was a request for $250,000 for the city to work in coordination with WashDOT, Amtrak, Sound Transit, and neighboring jurisdictions to complete a multimodal transportation study to determine how best to use current and future facilities to serve the region. We worked with members of the city's delegation to submit this request to both the House and the Senate, but Unfortunately, with the passage of 976, the state's multimodal account was the hardest hit, and transportation budget writers were looking for things within the transportation account multimodal transportation account to cut, and we're not in a position to allocate new funding. The budget did, however, include an appropriation for the Joint Transportation Committee to conduct a study on the rail safety governance best practices for passenger and freight, which will include transit rail service. And this study must consider the recommendations from the NTSB report from the 2017 Amtrak derailment. This concept was spearheaded by Representative Mari Levitt and was initially included in House Bill 2287, which did not pass the legislature, but much of the concepts that were included in that bill were included in proviso language in the transportation budget. So that study is due to the legislature January of 2021. Next on the city's agenda were legislative requests on the horizon. And as Brianna mentioned previously, the city was successful in securing funding for both capital projects in the first half of the biennium. So since this was a non-budget year, we used this as an opportunity to lay the groundwork for future requests. As a city, Lakewood strategically selects capital budget priorities located in each of the city's legislative districts. So for the 28th district, we focused on improvements at Fort Steilacoom Park. And for the 29th district, we're looking for the state's partnership to expand Wards Lake Park. Getting these projects on legislators' minds early helps the city be successful in securing state funding when it is a budget year. So this early advanced work is important. And I guess just a reminder that it often takes several years to achieve a legislative priority.
Shelley, I'll just add one comment that one of the advantages of advancing these legislative requests early is that it allows us to get feedback from the legislative delegation in order to modify or change the request in the subsequent year when the funding opportunity is very real. And so it makes us very well prepared for 2021 when there will be dollars available. I just want to flag that we got good feedback from the delegation on these funding requests that we can discuss as we prepare for 2021. Sorry to interrupt, Shelley, go ahead.
No, that's a great point. Thanks for adding that. So in addition to the city's legislative agenda, Lakewood adopts a policy manual, which guides our engagement on a variety of other topics that come up throughout a legislative session. So as I mentioned, the written report covers these in much greater detail, but I do want to just note a few for you this evening. The first, House Bill 2342, this passed the legislature, and it extends the deadline by 1 year for when the city has to update the comprehensive plan. So it pushes it out to 2024. And then it does the same thing with the shoreline master plan update, pushes it out to 2028. One of the reasons this was done was to allow the legislature more time to consider changes to the Growth Management Act, specifically related to potentially including a climate change goal or element. So that discussion began this year. Nothing made it across the finish line. And so they're wanting to give themselves more time to consider that. The next bill to highlight that passed this year is Senate Bill 6617 regarding accessory dwelling units. Again, this year there was a big push to remove city authority to regulate ADUs. There is a line of thinking amongst some legislators and stakeholders that ADUs, which are a key part of the solution to the affordable housing crisis, are not being constructed because of onerous and arbitrary city codes. So for the second year in a row, the legislature considered several pieces of legislation that would have eliminated or significantly hampered a city's authority to regulate ADUs. We worked with a coalition of cities and the Association of Washington Cities to fight against the notion that cities are standing in the way of affordable housing. Ultimately, we arrived at a version that will not cause harm to city control, but still appease the advocates. So Senate Bill 6617 removes the ability for a city to require an on-site parking spot for an ADU that's within a quarter mile of a major transit stop that has service at least every 15 minutes. However, cities can still implement these parking requirements for an ADU within a quarter mile if that area lacks access to street parking or other physical impediments. The next bill is House Bill 1023, which allows for certain adult family homes to increase capacity from 6 to 8 beds. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this bill. It's been around for several years. It did pass the legislature this year. Over the years that it's been considered, there have been various concerns that have been raised by stakeholders, and many of those concerns were addressed in this version of the bill. For example, firefighters had concerns with increasing the capacity and what that would mean in case of evacuation or emergency. So this bill's language includes a requirement that the home have a residential sprinkler system in place and have demonstrated the ability to comply with emergency evacuation standards. In response to some of the concerns that the city raised, Senator O'Ban sponsored an amendment that will require DSHS to notify the local jurisdiction of an applicant's request to increase bed capacity, and then allows the local jurisdiction to provide a recommendation to the department as to whether or not they should approve that application. There was a really strong desire to pass this bill because of the need for additional long-term housing capacity for an aging population. So this bill takes effect June 11th. The next bill is a statewide plastic bag ban, which will take effect January 1st of 2021. Under the new law, customers can purchase thicker plastic bags or paper bags for 8 cents. That goes into effect until 2026. Then in 2026, the charge for the thicker plastic bags will increase to 12 cents. And the reason for still allowing thicker plastic bags and then pricing them higher in the future is to allow the state's paper mills to increase production to be able to meet the increased demand for paper bags. Just amongst the jurisdictions that had already implemented their plastic bag bans, there was already a backlog and demand for paper bags. And then lastly, it's not a bill that passed the legislature, but I did want to highlight that the South Sound Military and Communities Partnership was successful in securing funding for the Department of Commerce to administer the Defense Community Compatibility Account. This is a grant program that was created through the passage of Senate Bill 5748 in 2019, but was not funded in the biennial budget. So with this appropriation, the Department of Commerce will be able to continue administering the program and is planning to provide a recommended list of projects to the legislature for funding for consideration in development of their biennial capital budget in 2021. So that's a really quick overview of what happened in the 2020 legislative session. Couple things to mention moving forward. There are rumors of a special session which may be needed to provide additional resources for the COVID-19 response. Legislative leadership has said if it does come to that, which I think they are reticent to call people back to Olympia and hold a special session, they're working to figure out how they would be able to do that to still honor social distancing requirements. If there is a special session, it will likely be very brief, and many of the decisions about what needs to be accomplished will likely be determined in advance. Aside from the coronavirus, this is an election year, and all the House and half the Senate are up for election. Additionally, there are several legislators that have announced they will be retiring, including Lakewood's Representative Christine Kilduff, who has served the 28th District for 6 years. A little further ahead, after the census, there will be redistricting in 2021 to ensure that districts represent an equal number of the population. Then the outcome of the redistricting will go into effect for the 2022 election. So with that, I will turn it back over to Brianna to wrap things up.
Sure. And before we leave the subject of a potential special session, I'll just to note that there are several different areas that the governor may have to call the legislature back into session in order to address. One of those may be making further budget reductions to the 2019-21 budget and 2020 supplemental budget that was just signed into law. If that is the case, you'll recall that the city receives state shared revenues from several different state accounts. And if there are across the board cuts being made, similar to what we saw during the recession that started in 2008, those state shared revenues may be at risk. So we are very actively following the developments around a special session and what content may be considered. And that is top of our mind. In addition to a special session, I just want to emphasize a few different things as we think about our advocacy moving forward. I want to remind everyone to say thank you. Not only was the 2020 legislative session a really good amount of progress on some of our long-term objectives, but it built on an incredibly successful 2019 session. And it's important that we thank our legislators for the hard work that they do. We often bring to them our requests and our problems, but it's important to also express to them appreciation. So please do so if and when you see them or hear from them out and about in the community or on various Zoom calls. As a reminder that lobbying really is a year-round effort. So Shelley and I will be advocating for the city well before you all finalize your legislative agenda for the 2021 session. And over those interim months, we will be focusing on the items that you have identified as long-term priorities. And one of those that I know we have an intention of spending a lot of time on is identifying a financing tool for Lakewood Landing. This last session was very helpful in identifying some key legislators that we would like to have some one-on-one meetings with to help elevate and advance that issue in 2021. We also want to look at what the city's transportation priorities are moving forward as we continue to observe the development of a transportation revenue package. And then finally, continue to advance the capital funding requests that you all have identified at Fort Steilacoom Park and Wards Lake expansion. So in short, it was a great 2020 session, but there's more work to be done and we're ready to do it. And I think with that, we'll pause and ask if you all have any questions.
Well, thank you. Remember, council members, if you wish to speak, please raise your virtual hand and mute when you are not speaking. Mr. Brandstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Brianna, you mentioned that future years of the transportation funding plan that we're in the midst of are no longer valid, even though they're going to complete the projects for this year. What does that really mean with respect to the rest of the I-5 congestion plan that's down at at the main gate of JBLM and into DuPont, assuming that means that the work around Tillicum is actually going to be done? And then even further, what does that mean? Does that mean that funding is seriously in jeopardy for the motorized path from Thorn Lane to Gravelly Lake Drive that was sort of like going to become the last phase of that project?
Thank you, Councilmember Brandstetter, for the question, and it's a good one. So the out years of the 2015 Connecting Washington packet are still valid. They're just out of balance. There's a revenue shortfall in those years. The question of how will the legislature balance that revenue shortfall is a good one, and one that we don't know the answer to at this time. I do think that projects that are already underway, like the I-5 JBLM improvements, are at a very low risk of the funding being impacted. What we're more likely to see is projects that have not yet begun, that were scheduled to start in that 21-23 biennium, and that was the first dollars allocated to that project, may get pushed back or negatively impacted. I think the other component of that you asked was about the gravelly Lake to Thorn non-motorized trail. I believe that is on schedule to be delivered. And I'll defer to Shelley if for some reason that is incorrect, but I believe that that is scheduled to be delivered on time as well. So that would not be negatively impacted. I'll just conclude with, in our advocacy around the 2015 package, we argued vehemently for the improvements along I-5 and other liquid improvements to be as early in that funding schedule as possible. That advocacy is paying off now as we're looking at revenue shortfalls in the out years of that package.
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, I'm not so worried about the Lakewood pieces around Tillicum and that thing over there, but the South Sound Military Community Partnership, I think, would be concerned about the entire length of pieces all the way down through DuPont that haven't been started yet and were scheduled to be a later phase. The second transportation question that I had for you, that there was a diversion of gas tax money that would normally have come to cities that has been withheld and is going to be retained by the state. And I think the number was 10 million. But was that look like a one-time thing, or does that look like a permanent going forward, that the formula is changed for a while?
Thanks. I'll take a stab at that question. So I think you're referring to, in the written report, it includes that there is a $10 million reduction in the gas tax share that's shared with local governments. And what that is just a decline in gas tax revenues overall. And so the distribution, since it's a formula of total gas tax revenues, the decline to local distributions is 10 million. So it's not an expectation that that will continue unless gas tax revenue continues to decline. But it is just the state implementing the formula that has been in place. There's no change to the formula.
Okay, thank you. And my last question really has to do with the special session. And if the governor calls a special session and he identifies the parameters for it, would that be something that it would be appropriate that Lakewood prepare like a one-page priorities document to share?
That's
And during special sessions, are there committee hearings and things that you testify on, or is that just the legislature meeting?
great question. So if there is a special session, the focus will be on COVID-19 responses, and that will be focused on budget work. So I don't anticipate that there would be committee hearings. I imagine that a lot of the decisions about what needs to be updated in the biennial budget will be made in advance, and the special session will be just convening the legislature in order to take the necessary votes to update the budget. In response to your question about how should Lakewood be preparing for a special session, I think city staff is already thinking about this, but as you all know, the federal package, the CARES Act, included funding for direct distribution to jurisdictions above 500,000, and then the remaining amount is distributed to the state. The state is still trying to figure out what it looks like for, and if that that funding is distributed to jurisdictions lower than 5,000 in population. So I think if there is something for the legislature to consider, depending again on the timing of when the governor's office makes a decision about how to distribute those resources, that it would be beneficial for Lakewood to allocate, or I guess specifically list what the increased costs are for city operations in response to COVID-19 outbreak. And then secondly, so in a separate category, what are the increased costs? And then secondly, what are the estimated decline in revenues? So that legislators get a more full picture of what the city's fiscal situation is. Again, I think a special session will really focus on the city's or the state's finances. Brianna, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that the city manager and city staff did get us some early information on the city's financial impacts, and that information I think is adequate, and the outreach that we're doing through the Association of Washington Cities to help prepare for a special session and any budget impacts. So I don't think the city needs to go as far as adopting any sort of formal special session legislative priorities. I think we've already received, and city staff has been great about getting us additional information, continue to receive updated information on the financial outlook, which is the key focus.
All right, thank you very much.
Mr. Whalen.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Branstetter asked my first question about the Connecting Washington package and how it might impact the JBLM I-5 corridor work. So I'll jump to the second question, which was on the LRF funding work that you guys did for the LRF awards. So given that we made great strides forward, what would be your recommendation as to the fresh, renewed strategy for getting us over the hurdle? You know, given the COVID issue and the need to, resurrect our economy, it seems to me that a selling point might be the fact that these kinds of tools will really incentivize good economic development, which will put more construction folks back to work in the construction trade for the benefit of not just the city of Lakewood, but the state of Washington with retail sales tax and other benefits. So how do we help our legislators further understand the need to get over the hurdle on this?
I think you're going to benefit here from a two-person team, because I'm going to give a glass half full perspective and Shelley's going to give you a glass half empty perspective. And I think that accurately reflects the realities that are Olympia. I share your optimism that there's a way of convincing the legislature that these economic development tools can be part of our state's economic recovery, and that it's worthy of their state investments. And we've got a good track record of projects such as the LRF awards issued in the early 2000s that have shown a really good return on investment for state revenues and jobs generated.
Right.
So I think that's helpful to our cause. The reality is that the proposal costs state dollars, and that does make it challenging. And I think I'll pause there and see if Shelley has anything more to add. I think that's the biggest challenge, and in her eyes, I think that's a hard one to overcome. But go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, and I think so. One of the big takeaways from this session that I think is really helpful for us in developing a strategy moving forward is we learned that the House is very supportive of this type of tool. A vote of 94-3 out of the House, when it's going to cost the state $15 million a year for 20 years. That's an excellent piece of feedback for us. But as is with many budget challenges, the Senate budget writers tend to be a little bit more, I guess, for lack of a better word, judicious in what they're willing to allocate state resources towards. So I think really our focus moving forward will need to be on Senate budget writers in particular.
Well, other than the fact that they were being conservative in their approach, what seems to be on the Senate budget side, the trigger points. I mean, I understand that it's a tool that costs the state money, but the state is throwing money after just about everything right now that may not necessarily generate economic activity, which is what we're going to need to see. So if somehow they can be encouraged and educated that this really is a win-win, as opposed to just, throwing money at any number of, good endeavors, but don't necessarily have the same positive impact, hopefully that will get them over the hurdle.
Yeah,
need to-
I think.
We need to find out what their cognitive dissonance is to the concept and really address it.
One of them that I think we are slowly starting to address is a concern that this type of tool is a handout to developers and that these developments would occur anyway. So we've heard that, and we are starting to make progress with budget writers on recognizing that the way that the bill was drafted this year put really important sideboards into place to ensure that that won't occur. And then additionally, the communities that come forward to advocate for this type of tool, having projects to show this project is not going to advance, but for the state's partnership is another thing that was important this year, that more cities getting engaged in that will be helpful.
And I'll just add, the other challenge that we have faced is a hesitancy, not necessarily in making a single year investment, but in making a 20-year investment. So I know that Chairwoman Rolfes and the Senate Ways and Means Committee just has a lot of concern about tying up future revenues without having any idea what the budget will look like in 10 or 15 years. And part of that was her concern around a forthcoming economic recession. And part of that was, I think, her experience of now sitting in the role of budget writer and having previous legislatures making similar decisions in previous years, previous decades, and her seeing that state revenue tied up and not under her decision-making control. And I think that's a valid concern. It's a hard one to overcome. She really has to see the value of the program and the long-term fiscal benefit of the program to be convinced that it's worth making that long-term commitment.
Okay, third question, and then I have a comment. So the third question on the legislative on the horizon priorities that we've discussed. So we had a pre-session meeting with our legislators, and I sensed some hesitance on the part of the 29th district to perhaps support the Wards Lake work over some other competing priorities. What was your sense through the session as to whether or not the on the horizon asks by Lakewood, specifically with regard to the parks projects, have any legs?
Yeah, so I'll start specifically with Wards Lake. In our conversations with legislators throughout the session, there was definitely openness, and I'd say even more than openness, and eagerness to see Wards Lake Park expanded and improved. I think in our conversations with legislators, we tried to keep it as flexible as possible for the city to come forward with a request that, whether that's expansion or different types of improvements. I know staff is working on the master plan right now. So we wanted to make sure that there was as much flexibility as possible in putting together that request for next year.
Okay.
And then for Fort Steilacoom Park improvements, initially there was discussion around requesting lighting for the ball fields. And I think this is an example of the early feedback that we received. There wasn't a lot of excitement amongst the delegation to advance a request for ball field lighting. We got feedback that there are more important priorities at Fort Steilacoom Park. And so it wasn't so much a no, we don't want to see improvements at Fort Steilacoom Park. We thought that there should be different priorities. So again, very, very helpful feedback in knowing what are the components of improvements at the park that the delegation would be willing to support.
And I assume more to follow on that, because I'm not sure, other than our own legislative priorities that we've communicated to them, what their thoughts are on different priorities to us that might be better than the ones we articulated.
Well, I know specifically that there was a lot of excitement about the restoration of the barns.
Okay.
I know that they have heard that from constituents, overlapping constituents with the city, of course, and so that's one that they thought was kind of an exciting prospect for the city to prioritize.
Good to hear. Okay. My last question is, in one of the pieces of legislation that passed, it was one in which there was a cost of living adjustment provided for PERS 1 recipients, including those within various cities. And my question is, do we know what the fiscal note on the city side will be with regard to that legislation?
That is a great question. I don't know off the top of my head if the city has, John has the answer.
Mayor, can I be recognized?
City manager.
Thank you. Yeah, we don't have any PERS 1 employees, so there is no impact.
Very good.
Likewise, we don't have any Left 1 employees either.
Okay, so very good. So I appreciate that. That is all the question, or those are all the questions I have. Thank you very much.
Is there anything else for Ms. Helder, Ms. Murray? Well, thank you very much. You've done a great job for us, and we look forward to more successes in the future.
Wonderful, our pleasure.
Thank you.
We now move to the next item, which is a review of human services funding recommendations.
Yeah, good evening, Council. All right, working with Brianna a little bit. You guys can hear me?
Yes.
All right, well, thank you guys for taking the time for me to present this evening. The purpose for our time together is to present the joint recommendation from the Lakewoods Promise and Community Services Advisory Boards for the human services funding areas or categories for the 2021-22 biennium. You may have already reviewed all the documents in your packet, but I'll skip to the last page of the book for a second and just tell you that their recommendation is basically to keep things more or less as they are, with some edits to clarify, simplify the process. But the context in which they came to that conclusion to make that recommendation is important information for you to have. So I have a short presentation to go through that for you. First, I included in your packets some information, some documents that I don't intend to go over in great detail, but I thought you would want to have access to them during this conversation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. First is the output summary from our 2019 funded organizations. So you can see the current programs we fund within our 5 categories. And I know there's a bit of, I did this earlier, there's a little bit of a lag, but in just a second, you'll see the second one, which is the summary you've seen before of the 6 bienniums of funding. This one is important. It's not even on my screen, so it's probably not on yours yet, but it's in your packet. This one's important because it shows that even with the more rigorous rating and review process we ended up with pretty much the same partners being funded. So we feel we have the right partners at the table. There isn't a lot of enthusiasm to fix what doesn't seem to be broken. So I also included updated drafts of the application process and the current draft of the rating review sheet. Since I'm going to be, originally I was going to go over those with you as well, but since I'm going to come back in June, I figured tonight we would talk about overall strategy and the survey and the funding areas. And then in June, we would go over the technical documents, but I left them in your packet. I figured you'd want to see them and you'd wonder where they were if we didn't have them. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So what I'm going to show you is the same PowerPoint I used to facilitate the joint advisory board meeting in March, where they crafted this recommendation. They asked me to present this same PowerPoint to you, so you have the same context. So as we talked about in the fall, I wanted to update the needs assessment ahead of the next biennium. I wanted it to be an actionable, data-driven narrative that answers the questions we know the community is already asking. Lakewood's Promise and the Community Services Advisory Board worked with me to create a joint survey. We had 350 responses we collected online. We used a really cool text to take it on your phone software, and we made little posters for it and put them around the community where we thought families would see them, and where if they had a couple minutes, they would take it online. We got about 100 responses from that. We had community conversations at YMCA, at the library, 2 in Springbrook, and at the community collaboration meeting. We talked a little bit in the fall about the initial results, and those informed our 2020 work plans. This presentation is an abbreviated version of a report that is currently in draft form and being edited by a graphic designer. She's had some family issues as a result of the COVID crisis, so that's a little bit slower than I would like, but I'm getting that as quick as I can. And then I have been, the question I've asked is, what are the big picture things the city is working on? How does Human Services overall complement that effort? And then how do we line up everything within Human Services so we're doing that with excellence? And this presentation is essentially the narrative of the result of that process. So rather than survey the community about what the needs are, since, well, A, we don't have really good updated data. We're still using 2014 census data. We're still using 2017 ACS data for 2020, 2019 reports. And the community, we know what the challenges are. The community knows what the challenges are. The community knows we know what the challenges are. So what we did was ask them to rate the severity of the needs that we offer or might offer, and we offered them the opportunity to provide qualitative feedback. So not surprisingly, everything is a priority: transportation, access to food, access to healthcare, parenting classes, mentorship for youth. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being most needed, everything scored at least a 3. However, 3 things consistently stood out as almost always being rated as a 5. And those things were affordable housing and homelessness, no shock there. Safety, which we'll talk about in a second, and youth mental health. This one surprised me in large part because it was the 15 to 24-year-olds who self-identified that youth mental health was the second biggest need in the community behind affordable housing and homelessness. So this might not be a surprise to all of you. It was a little bit of a surprise to me. Apparently, it's been much longer since high school than I realized. I've talked to a lot of our youth serving organizations since this and gotten a lot of unfortunate feedback. The youth are anxious, they're depressed, they're stressed out. Apparently, there's a lot of academic pressures, social pressures, technology. This is some we'll talk about in a second, but these are why these 2 things ended up on our affordable housing and homelessness and youth mental health on our 2020 work plans. Before we go on to talk about those 2 things, let's talk about safety for just a second. Safety was rated as a 5 consistently, and that included safe places for youth to play and thrive and community safety. We're not going to read all of these, but I extrapolated all the qualitative responses of people who rated safety as a 5. I printed them out and I highlighted them, color-coded them based on type of response. So who associated safety with homelessness, with drug addiction, with law enforcement, and just kind of went through and visually saw what kind of responses we were getting. We're not seeing a lot of I am unsafe, I have experienced a lack of safety answers. What we do see, like these samples show, is a perception of a lack of safety or a fear of future lack of safety based on seeing more homelessness, seeing tents, and seeing crime shared on social media that's typically associated with homelessness. So yes, there is certainly a law enforcement issue, and we wish we had a lot more things going on. But from a human services perspective, we think that if we were able to move the needle on the affordable housing and homelessness problem, that would also move the needle on the perception of safety as a need in the community. So from this point on, we kind of take that off our list. There are a lot of things that Human Services does, but this kind of leaves the 3 BHAGs for 2020 as those 2 things we just identified: affordable housing and homelessness and youth mental health, and then the 2021 Human Services funding. Let's talk about that first one, which is the main one we're going to talk about. So one of my goals has been to change the narrative, or try to change the narrative, about what homelessness is and who is experiencing it. So these are snapshots from that Seattle is Dying special I'm sure a lot of you have seen that came out last year. This is a good example of the narrative I hear a lot, you probably hear a lot. I hear people say, I see more tents, I see more needles. I think people are using drugs and on the street because they choose to, and that's what homelessness is. I hear this a lot that, I saw someone experiencing homelessness, I offered them food and they said they want the cash instead. So my assumption is that's what homelessness is. And yes, we do have this type of homelessness and we wish we could address this more and better, but the reality is this would require a lot of resources and it requires some hard conversations about things like involuntary inpatient or outpatient treatment. And the reality is we probably won't be able to move the needle on this type of homelessness without a pretty significant commitment from the state and federal government. Meanwhile, there's another face to homelessness the broader community does not get to see, but it is more urgent and more solvable. We have a child homelessness and housing insecurity problem that is hard to quantify because it is hard to count. We have families with parents working multiple jobs who increasingly cannot make ends meet. Many of them are trying to train for better jobs, but they have a hard time making ends meet while they do so. We don't see them when they become homeless because they take other drastic measures. We have 2 to 3 families living in 1-bedroom apartments. Families move into cars and shelters. They're couch surfing in strangers' home, which subjects children to all kinds of toxic stress and abuse. This is a demographic we currently support with the existing human services funding. And this is who we think about when we talk about the strategic family workforce development initiatives in the Lakewood's Promise work plan. Community development already presented some of this information last month. They're going to present some more, but a couple of numbers to quantify the affordable housing homelessness problem. We saw the median home value in Lakewood last year, $335,000. Home prices are rising. Median rent for a 2-bedroom is about $1,600 a month right now, and according to Zillow, it's about $1,200 for a low end. I've joined all of the Lakewood community groups on Facebook to try to get just a reading of what people are looking for, and I see a lot of, I need a 2-bedroom. I can't spend more than $1,000, and people are sharing $1,200 entry-level 2-bedroom apartments. The average hourly rate right now in Lakewood is $17.31 according to PayScale. Just like the median home value is pulled up by some high-value homes, the average hourly wage is also pulled up by people that earn more money. And if you go talk to Springbrook residents, you hear a lot of $14 an hour jobs and 25 hours a week. But if we go with 1731 and we use the traditional rule of thumb that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing, then that person, that family should not be spending any more than $900 a month on rent. So there's obviously a gap there. That's a problem. Now, the 30% might be a little bit outdated, but those are the numbers. The way I would like to look at it is the other way, and to say, what does a family need to earn to be able to thrive? And if you're looking at a $1,200 a month apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, and you have one income earner, you should be earning $23 an hour. For $1,500 a month, you should be earning $29 an hour. And then I have the living wages here for Pierce County adults. One thing we would, obviously one of the first solutions is to have, we hope we have 2-parent households and then both parents are working. And in a lot of cases, especially if they have help with childcare, that is doable and that's how people are getting by. However, for a lot of families, that's not feasible because you run into the prohibitively notorious, or the notoriously prohibitive cost of childcare. So usually a second income earner, their income is wiped out by the cost of childcare. So the second parent chooses to stay home, solves the childcare problem, but does not solve the affordable housing problem. The other part of the work I've been doing the past year is to understand and articulate to internally and with our partners why fulfilling the 5 promises for Lakewood's Promise requires addressing families and communities in addition to providing direct service to youth. And one of the best tools to do that is the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. I'm sure many of you already know about ACEs, but the CDC defines them as these 10 potentially traumatic events that occur in children 0 to 17 years old, or are aspects of the child's environment that can undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, and are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance abuse in adulthood. And one report I read about homelessness and ACEs, I thought put it well and said, the experience of housing insecurity defined as high housing costs, poor housing quality, unstable neighborhoods, overcrowding, and especially homelessness places children at risk of ACE exposure. Housing insecure youth and families report instances of physical and emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and sex trafficking while staying in shelters, on the streets, or doubled up with acquaintances, families, or strangers. Just for context, more than half the population has at least one ACE, more than a quarter, 2 or more. 1 in 8 have 4 or more ACEs. 4 ACEs is when you're starting to cross that threshold of a potential really challenging outcome in adulthood. And children below the poverty line are 5 times more likely to experience 4 or more ACEs. So as I said, a challenge in recent years has been adapting to new urgencies and a changing understanding of what it means to support children, youth, and families. Affordable housing and homelessness has become a dominant problem. It increases the severity of the whole range of social and economic problems we're trying to tackle with the human services funding. And ACES provides some clarifying language about that urgency and the interconnectedness of everything that we're doing. That's a very brief, overly brief summary of what we mean by affordable housing and homelessness prevention. The next question is, what are the city's overall strategies to address this problem so we can understand where the funding has the most impact in context? So I coordinate with community and economic development as best I can. I think of their work as primarily the long-term strategies to increase housing density, preserve housing stock that we do have, and expand economic opportunities. We have more jobs and more jobs that pay a higher wage. That leaves Lakewood's promise and the community collaboration and any capacity I can muster to work on the medium-term strategy of navigating families into higher paying jobs so they can afford whatever housing we do have while we execute our longer-term housing strategies. So this is why the Promise 2020 work plan includes a workforce development initiative, and the committee that is working on this is meeting for the first time next week, and it's being led by Dr. Joyce Loveday from Clover Park, who's also a vice chair for the Promise Board, and she's convened basically a lot of the people who are doing workforce development who have this same vision. We need to understand what the good paying jobs are, what they will be, how do you attain those competencies, and does the community understand what those pathways are? So that context, well, that basically summarizes the first one. I'm just gonna have one slide about this second one. About youth mental health. And given our limited capacity, we look for partnerships to strengthen what other people may already be doing rather than try to do something new that might be redundant we don't have resources or capacity for anyway. This issue of youth mental health is on a lot of people's minds, in particular Ron Banner over at the school district. They are really excited about adapting this model out of Virginia called 3 to Succeed. It has a track record of reducing youth anxiety and depression when executed in the schools. So the school district is creating a toolkit based on this model specifically for Lakewood schools, and Lakewood's Promise is going to partner with them whenever that toolkit is ready to make this a community-wide initiative rather than just something in the school district. So this will likely include things we are already excited about, like mentorship and service opportunities for youth, and some training and calls to action for how adults engage youth in a helpful way. As we have more information about this one, we'll give it to you. Obviously, this time frame has been very much impacted by the COVID crisis. So Ron's kind of told us all to be in the holding pattern, but that one is there. All right, so all that context about the affordable housing problem, how Lakewood families are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity, what the city's already doing for long-term strategies, what Lakewood's Promise is doing for medium-term strategies, all that illuminates the path for human services to continue to be a broad portfolio of shorter-term support services for families and youth so they don't fall through the cracks while we're working on our medium-term and long-term strategies. So since our existing process and categories yielded the mix of programs and partners that we think are appropriate to do that, the advisory board's joint recommendation is to basically keep that process in place. And then this second to last slide, I guess, is basically a one-page summary of everything I just said. The long-term strategy, largely in community and economic development's camp, to increase and preserve the housing stock that we have, increase economic growth and opportunity. The medium-term strategy is these family workforce development navigation efforts and a youth mental health initiative in partnership with the school district. YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, other people that partner on this. And the short-term strategy is the human services funding. These are the current 5 strategies. And then the very last slide, which is not on yours, but I added tonight just for the fun of it, is this is in your memo, but the 5 categories as we recommend them, with these clarifying pithy definitions that we added. So the recommendation from the Lakewood's Promise and Community Services Advisory Board would be to adapt these as the categories for the next biennium of funding. And with that, I will take any questions you might have.
Mr. Whalen.
Brian, thank you for the information. It's always really helpful. One question I had for you is, in the continuing quest to get more data, do we have any updates from the recent county point in time count that was done, I think in February?
Yeah, I have the most recent one. I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was for county. I think it was something like 1,600. The main thing that I have is how many, especially of the rural communities, they disapprove of the data. So people like Bethel, I think Bethel said that they were counted as having something like 200 homeless children, and the superintendent there says we think it's more like 600. You're just not finding them, right? And really for the same reasons I just laid out, right? They're hard to count, they're hard to find, depending on how you define homelessness. Like if you're couch surfing, you're not considered homeless, but they are in reality.
Right.
Yeah, done. Mayor.
Mr. Bradstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think that I appreciate the effort that the committee has gone through over months to try to give some thought to this and to move forward. And I do appreciate the emergence of youth mental health as a more visible, targeted area that is needed in the community. However, I'm a little uncomfortable moving forward to make with a process that's going to decide on funding issues over the next 2 years based on a needs assessment that is pre-COVID-19 and not having a real clear picture of the aftermath of COVID-19 in terms of human services needs, given that it's pretty certain that, to the extent that we don't know, but to some extent, 1% of the general fund will be a lower amount of money than we've had in the past. And so, I'm concerned that just using the same process of going through using an old needs assessment, coming up with a process that leads to essentially a 2-year funding solution and an application process may not be what we need to do right at this point in time. That I think that we need to get another good handle about, the best we can, some assessment of the needs, other than to say the old needs will still be there, that maybe they'll just be worse. I think there's a real potential for some new needs to emerge in the aftermath of COVID-19. And that we need to be able to say that our human services funding program has got some flexibility to be able to adjust rather than do it the way we've done it before, which kind of gets it locked in. I do appreciate that in the area of affordable housing, that the affordable housing piece is more a community development issue, and that human services funding is more perhaps attuned to homelessness prevention, more so than has been in the past in our allocation overall of human services funding. So what is our ability to update our needs assessment given the current situation with the COVID-19? And also, I am concerned that the needs assessment in our effects things conflicts with some recent information that was provided to council about the needs of seniors in the community, where we heard from both Wes Pierce and then we heard from research that was done with dealing with CDBG funding about single seniors who are renting. A huge percentage of them are in very difficult straits, and they are not, we've traditionally focused very much on youth with very little focus on seniors. And of how do we go to build in some focus on seniors, or at least some balance away from youth to do that? I mean, has there been any discussion around the needs of seniors and the human services needs of seniors in the community by the committee?
Yeah, we have talked about it in the collaboration, especially since as a certified financial coach, I spend a lot of time with seniors and hear this a lot, right? My rent now exceeds my Social Security payments. What do I do? And I can't go back to work for some reason. And those are the most frustrating, especially when you hear about all the fraud and things that go on. We do talk about that, but there are also lots of demographics we would like to serve. And historically, Human Services has had a mandate, largely because of promise, to focus on children, youth, and families. And the Human Services funding already does serve a lot of seniors in what we already support, so that's in there. But the focus has typically been children, youth, and families. But to the degree that we have a clear path forward on seniors, would love to execute that.
Well, if the council were to decide that we would like to have an increased emphasis on doing something for particularly low income, fixed income seniors, you'd be able to make some adjustments in terms of that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
May I share? Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I had a couple of questions about the technical documents that, while you didn't go over them, since they were provided to us, I would like to present them so that as you're getting ready to come back to us in June, you can look at doing that. That there's on the rating sheet, the very first item has to do with awarding points for the percentage of Lakewood residents that are served by a program. And I was wondering, what was the thought of awarding more points for 50 to 75% than for programs that serve more than 75%?
Oh, well, that is clearly just a typo. I'm going to chalk that one up to new dad brain. But obviously it should be the other way around. More than 75% would be 2 points, 50 to 75% would be 1 point.
Okay. Further down, there is a question. Let me look. I can give you what the number is. It's question 4C, and on the rating sheet, it is a thing about where it's a new thing that they decided to ask applicants to document their commitment to equity, inclusion, and things. And I guess I am saying, what really prompted the need for that question, and for the idea that it would, and that points should be assigned to the answer.
Well, the organization's commitment to equity is something that's important to the Community Services Advisory Board. Ultimately, all this is up to you, but this was something that was very important to them to consider. When we looked at other human services applications that ask this question, typically what they ask is tell us how diverse your board of directors is. But our Community Services Advisory Board felt that that was pigeonholing the organization. And if they're going to ask that question, they would rather broaden it because the organization might have different ways to answer that question. So they left it somewhat open-ended. So we suspect some organizations might just give us a not very specific answer about how excited they are about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some organizations might get into great detail about actual efforts or the diversity of their boards. And that tells us if, especially if an organization has a board of directors that reflects of the diversity of the community they're trying to serve, they're probably going to do so more effectively and with more cultural kind of understanding. So that's the value of that. And that's why we left it a little bit broader.
Well, I think you're right that you're going to see a broad spectrum of the way that question is answered, and you're going to end up in a it's going to be really subjective as to how you can evaluate and award points on an answer to that piece over there. And I would wonder whether you might beta test that with a few organizations, ask them to give you an answer and see whether that's really going to provide a basis for you to put points on a rating sheet to where that maybe is going to be a deciding factor, given that I suspect that funding is going to allow us to fund fewer programs in these coming years than before. And I'm not sure that that's, well, that's a very politically correct question. I'm not quite sure it's one to go through and make. And then again, with respect to seniors, there are points on the rating sheet that you get extra points if you're serving youth and children. If there could be a way to put some points on the rating sheet for providing services that are targeting low-income seniors, so that those programs are not, that do so are not disadvantaged. Mr. Mayor, I would suggest that, we're going to look at this then in June, but I also think that we maybe want to consider whether, because we don't know the impacts of both on funding and on needs of aftermath of the COVID-19, whether instead of moving forward with a process that's going to lock in funding for 2 years, that we move, that maybe this is a year to only do 1 year contracts and then assess needs in terms as we go into the second half of the next biennium. I'd like to discuss that the next time we get together to discuss it. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I call on Mr. Wolke, I respond to that, Mr. Brandstetter. I want to remind the council that these are recommendations. I'm always suspect of formulaic assignment of numbers. I think they're good for a gross evaluation, but not for a fine evaluation. And especially in this time when things are changing. For example, I think in the last biennium, we gave something close to $150,000 for food banks. We may find a week or a month from now that coronavirus bill 4 from the federal government has fully funded food banks in the United States for the next 5 years. They're throwing a lot of money at specific things, and that's a very sympathetic thing. And in that case, we wouldn't want to give any money to food banks, even though it might be a highest priority if there was no money available for them. So I think we're going to have to look at this in a context and use our judgment in distributing the money. The committee does a fine job in its evaluation and bringing forth information, but I think we're going to have to take a hard look at a changed world and see what our priorities are a couple of months from now, and when we actually make the budget. Mr. Bulkey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Brian, first of all, just a couple of comments and then a question. I'm not surprised about the mental health thing, because dealing with the youth council, they've made it pretty clear that mental health, especially within the schools, is a priority for them, and they see real issues on that. The other thing is, I'm really excited about workforce development. I mean, before we hit this rough patch with COVID-19, I mean, workforce development was becoming the central issue, because there's just a real skills gap that we've created over the years, and I think that's good that we're having those conversations, and I hope that we can get all the right people at the table. My question has to do with the homelessness prevention side, which I'm excited about too. I think we've had some discussions at the council level about that. And I would think it would be things like utility payments and things along those lines to help prevent people from getting kicked out in the first place. But when I look at our funding history and our recent funding, I don't know that I see that there. So could you either point me in the direction on the current funding where we're helping with helping prevent homelessness, and two, did the committee have any other ideas about things that you might want to fund to help prevent homelessness?
Yeah, the majority of direct services for homelessness prevention is through LAHSA. And so they use their funding kind of for whatever a family needs through case management, which typically is things like utility assistance. Those things are great interventions. The challenge is it's expensive and it goes real fast, and it buys a family a month or two. And for a workforce development solution, you're talking about a year to 18 months to 24 years to get through a training program. So how do you make the math work? So it's just one of those, like, what gives us the best bang for our buck? And if you put all the money into utility assistance, you have a bunch of families who are, their problems are delayed, but they're no closer to being self-sustaining. So we've gone back and forth on that all the time, really from a supporting homelessness prevention. Let's say we had, hey, we know what these 30 jobs are that pay $25 an hour in Lakewood. Fantastic. We've raised awareness how you can get those jobs. It requires an 18-month certification at Clover Park or Pierce. Great. How do we get families through 18 months? Well, yes, it's a combination of all the things that we're funding, and it's probably going to have to rely on even more partnerships, maybe some grants to scale up things. Like we've talked about, can we scale up utility assistance specifically for a family that we know is going through a training program that we are confident is going to lead to a living wage job? We can't do that for 18 months for each and every family, but let's keep funding what we can fund, and let's look for more resources and partnerships to help those families get through those programs. Because two of our loudest partners on the Lakewood's Promise Advisory Board are Clover Park and Pierce, who are saying, fantastic that you want to get more people into training programs. We already have those families and they can't finish, because as soon as it comes down to, do I do laundry and buy diapers, or do I buy books? I guess I won't take classes this semester. They fall off. And that's going to require a little bit more leaning on the Promise Board and the collaboration and finding new resources. So yes, we've had those conversations.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you got some work to do on that then.
A little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Just for some quick context, one of the things we were already talking about, I know you have all been talking about through, and city manager's been talking with United Way about, is more financial coaching to complement these efforts, be a gap, an effort between the short-term services and the medium-term workforce development. And that is one of the main things we are planning to scale up more quickly as a result of COVID, especially since we know families have some stimulus checks coming, and they're going to have the enhanced unemployment through July. Families probably assume there's going to be more rental assistance and other things than they're actually going to have. So we want to make sure families use those resources wisely so they don't fall behind during this time. So that is one of the extra things I'm trying to work on.
Had to get unmuted here. Any further questions from Mr. Humphreys? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've got a lot of work to do. We now move to the rental housing safety program electrical update. Hello.
Mr. Buer had to turn the lights on apparently.
I'm waiting for Jeff Gum to join the conversation.
He's unmuted.
There we go. Jeff's going to lead off on the conversation and I'll join in where appropriate. Jeff, you want to go ahead and start?
I will do so. So tonight I wanted to accomplish three things. The memo provided to council on GFCIs is a follow-up to a March 9th study session. So tonight I wanted to kind of give you guys a brief update on what GFCIs are, where they can commonly be found, and then provide 4 options for council should you choose to go in a different direction for enforcement under the rental housing safety program for GFCIs. So as I mentioned, a quick review on GFCIs. They're specifically designed, they're called a ground fault circuit interrupter. So a GFCI is specifically designed to shut off electrical power to a location. It's typically a electrical outlet with any variation in electrical current. So there's 3 types of GFCIs. There's a receptacle type. Those are the ones that you would typically see in your household at a kitchen or bathroom location. 2 little buttons, 1 reset and 1 test. You test the GFCI. There's circuit breaker GFCIs. Circuit breakers are typically used in newer construction. You'll find those in the late 80s on. Those breakers specifically control multiple outlets. So there's a breaker at the panel and it controls typically a kitchen circuit or 2 kitchen circuits or multiple bathroom circuits. And excuse me, the other types are temporary GFCIs. So you see those on blow dryers. You see those on garbage disposers and those types of things. Those are the 3 primary GFCIs. The thing that when we did come to council on the 9th, we presented a budget of about, I believe it was $260 for changing out 2 GFCIs. We did some further research myself, building department, and some of the contractors that we work with, and came up with a little bit better number. That was a little bit inflated. Our new numbers are about $190 to $210 for 2 GFCIs for somebody to come in and install those in a household. Some of those numbers could be reduced if you're doing an apartment complex. There would be some clear efficiencies where an electrician would come in and replace multiple outlets throughout the complex. So those numbers would be decreased. Another option to both homeowners and apartment owners would be to use the breaker type GFCIs. So rather than going in and changing multiple outlets, one could go in and change a GFCI breaker and reduce the cost there. The GFCI requirements are specific to Ordinance 644 under the Rental Housing Safety Program. And those relate to, in your council agenda packet, there's some inspection checklists that you can see. Article 7.3 is specific to the city's inspection of GFCI receptacles. And currently what the city is enforcing on GFCIs is kitchens and bathrooms. We are looking under the Rental Housing Safety Program to inspect or to make sure that bathrooms and kitchens have an outlet receptacle protected GFCI within 6 feet. Yes?
You stated specific to the ordinance. Where in the ordinance does it mention that?
Well, articles, what it is Ordinance 644 corresponds to RCW 59, I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head, 59-125, I believe. And RCW 59-125 relates to a city enacting an inspection code for, there's about 8 or 9 different things, life safety things, electrical, structural issues. So Ordinance 644 relates to the RCW specifically.
So to clarify, it's not specific to the ordinance. is.
Correct.
Okay, you said it was specific to the ordinance, and I don't recall that ever being included in the ordinance. Thank you.
Correct. So the things that the city is inspecting under rental housing would be kitchens and bathrooms. So any outlet within 6 feet of a kitchen or bathroom sink, water source is what we're looking for. We do not enforce it for refrigerator outlets, because typically refrigerator outlets, even if it's within 6 feet of a sink, they're typically behind the refrigerator. They're inaccessible, so there would be no way to get to that, no way to trip it and reset it. The other thing is a washing machine and a laundry room. The other locations that we're looking at would not be considered a water source. Only in a laundry room would it be considered a source if there was a laundry basin or sink of that sort. So in a laundry room, not typically found in older homes, but in some of the newer homes, you'll find GFCIs in those. There are no other protections for GFCIs required under the current rental inspection code: kitchens, bathrooms, and laundry rooms. So the 4 options that we put in the memo for you all to look at would be: option 1 would be considering staying with the existing, which would be requiring GFCI protections in kitchens, bathrooms, and laundry rooms for outlets within 6 feet of a water source. Clearly, the pros and cons of that, I mean, the pros, there's no changes to the inspection schedule. It's consistent with what we've been doing. We have had some complaints, so that's obviously a con. And then some of the issues with homeowners modifying their systems, the cost of modification, that would be an issue. So option 2, we have no GFCI requirements, and that would clearly be no GFCIs to be inspected. So a cost savings to the homeowners. One thing, it would obviously not be consistent with what we have done in years past, or at least the last 2 years. So there could be some issues with that. And there could be some potential for deficiencies of electrical modifications if we're not specifically looking at GFCIs and going beyond those and looking at other things. There may be some issues that we don't catch. A third option would be to maintain what we call the existing conditions. So if there's an existing condition that a property has not been modified, that would be allowed to stay as it was. I mean, if they are modified, they have to bring them up to newer code. So that could potentially reduce some of the cost to the homeowners. It does allow existing buildings to be unmodified if they are that way. Some of the issues from an inspection standpoint, it would take a little extra time for staff to figure out, 1, when the building was created, 2, when certain things were modified, were permits created or were permits not created for that. And we'd have to do some research to figure that out. So that would require a little work on staff side. Option 4 would be requiring all units constructed pre-1975 to have GFCI protection of kitchens and bathrooms. So back in the March 9th presentation, we went through a myriad of GFCI dates, and 1975 was kind of the key date for when kitchens and bathrooms were initiated. So that would require bathrooms and kitchens within 6 feet. Some of that would reduce clearly the cost to older apartments where they're not having to modify those, so the owners would not have that cost incurred. It would allow existing buildings to remain unmodified. And it does kind of strike a middle ground. One of the things that obviously for city staff, it would take a little bit of extra time to check buildings' year of construction. We wouldn't necessarily have to do all of the follow-ups to make sure things were either modified or unmodified. It would be just a strike line at 1975 forward. So that's kind of a middle ground of the options. So again, if council were to make any changes to the GFCI program, staff would recommend option 4 in this case, as opposed to maintaining the existing if council does wish to change. So with that, I turn it back to Mr. Mayor, and any questions?
Questions for Mr. Gum? Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mayor. Jeff, thank you very much for that report, and thank you very much for the hard work you've done to modify this since we last discussed it. Now, I'm going to play my usual role here as devil's advocate, and I want to ask some questions here one of which is, and I apologize if it sounds a bit simplistic, what led city officials to bring this modification to us at this point in time?
That would be a question that Dave could answer. I know that we had some questions that were put through to myself and to Dave as well from property owners questioning why we were doing it. So I've seen some emails passed to me with those questions.
All right. Okay, all right. I also note that when I looked at the ordinance and then I tried to and compared it to RCW 59.18, I could not, while I could see a general comparison, I could not see anything specific linking one to the other, but that's neither here nor there. I have some concerns about this, and during our last time that we talked about this, we had I asked a question about empirical data and how we can, as a city, require rental property owners to install these electrical, ground protectors when there is no empirical data to suggest that we should. And I believe the question I asked Mr. Buer was, how many people have been electrocuted in Lakewood? And the answer was 0. Well, Mr. Brandstatter later made a comment about a nationwide look. So Mike, that is exactly what I did. And I have here some statistics that city staff are welcome to track down and verify. The first thing that I learned is that in kitchens, the biggest problem in kitchens are hot water burns. And there were 34 deaths of those in 2017. Also knives and bacteria. There was no mention of electrocution. The same applied to bathrooms, sharp objects, nail files, scissors, medicines, and vitamin pills. There was no mention of electrocution. All of this comes from the National Safety Council. I then went to the CDC and I looked at the 5 top fatal household injuries: poisoning, falling, choking, drowning, fires, or burns. Again, no mention of electrocution. But then I thought that's not good enough as evidence. That's not good empirical data. So I went to the US Consumer Product Safety Commission. And I learned that over the last 5 years, the average number of people who die in the United States due to electrocution in a home or rental property is less than 200. So I took 200, divided it by 300 million, and I come up with a number of 0.0000067%. In other words, statistically insignificant. I also cross-referenced this with the Washington State Department of Health and with the Tacoma-Pierce County Health Department. And on both websites, there is absolutely no reference with regard to accidents of electrocutions. So I'm left wondering, I come back to what I said, I guess almost a month ago, where is the empirical evidence that is giving the city the ability to say to a rental property owner, you need to make this change, when there is not statistically significant evidence to support that? It is not that I'm opposed to safety. It is not that I'm opposed to making our home safety. This is part of our rental housing safety program. This is about safety. But there has to be a reason. And at this point, Jeff and Dave, this looks to me to be a bit of overreach on the part of the city. So if you were to ask me to sum up where I come down on this, option 4 doesn't work. Option 3, however, is very close to the point that I'm making here. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Brandstatter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have one question for Mr. Gum about option 4. And that's the one of where we would not have laundry rooms. And earlier in your presentation, you spoke about a difference between laundry rooms and laundry rooms with sinks in them. How is option 4 related in that regard of where we wouldn't have laundry room requirement? Whether does that mean there wouldn't be a requirement even if there was a sink?
Yes. Option 4 specifically precludes laundry rooms. It would require them only in what we would consider primary uses of your electrical appliances, so in your kitchens and your bathrooms.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gum. I guess I do have a response to Council Member Simpson's seeking empirical data. And I would say that, as with many codes, the empirical data is not what has there been in the last 5 years or so to be able to go and do that. The issue is the last 5 years are indicative of the impact of 40 years of a code requiring these. And that has essentially virtually eliminated the negative impacts that I suspect that data prior into the 1970s indicated that this would be a good idea, given how difficult it is to get things into code. And at those times it's done. So I say the data to me is that enforcing the code has worked, and we should continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Gum or Mr. Buer, perhaps a clarification is in order with respect to option 3 and option 4. When you mentioned 1975, is it correct that the code was changed, Uniform Code was changed in 1975 to require GFCIs in certain locations? Is that what's significant about 1975?
Yes, 1970. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Well, from my understanding, the code involving GFCIs has been changed multiple times throughout many years, starting in 1971. And the code kept, those responsible for the code kept amending it to include new requirements. 1975 is a year in which we've seen a good majority of housing construction in Lakewood. And that's from my perspective as to why the 1975 appears to be a reasonable date from which to require the GFCIs. You want to add to that, Jeff?
No, that's perfect. Great answer.
So what was required? What did the Uniform Building Code require with respect to GFCIs in 1975?
In 1975, it was specific to bathrooms and kitchens. That was, or was it bathrooms? I'd have to go back in and look, but that was, I believe it was bathrooms that was added in 1975.
And before that, it had included kitchens.
1971 was the code prior. I believe kitchens came after. I'd have to go look back and look. There's been so many modifications. They're hard to keep track of which one was which.
Thank you. Mr. Whalen.
This is more of a question for Ms. Wachter. So if there was to be a change to one of these other options, would the city potentially have liability if we were going out now? We had done some GFCI requirements prior to June of 2020, and then post 2020, we've elected not to, and then there is an issue. Does it expose us to potential culpability if we don't at least make a note in an inspection checklist that the city, while not requiring a GFCI, if that's the will of the council, strongly recommends the owner consider replacing or installing GFCIs in the requisite locations?
Deputy Mayor Whalen and members of the council, you hit on a good point, and it actually plays off the point that Council Member Simpson was making. The question in these situations is typically not what do we individually or as a city think is safe. It is whether or not there's a standard out there that we are adhering to or not adhering to, and why we might not be doing that. And so, Deputy Mayor, your recommendation of perhaps at least advising people as to what the current standard is probably a good course, because it's acknowledging that people may or may not be able to afford that, and that it was in compliance with a pre-existing code at the time that they put it in that way. But at the same time, you're advising them, hey, here's the current standard, and you may want to take a look at that. But I would strongly caution the city against coming up with our own version of what we personally consider to be safe. That's not how these things typically work, but I defer to either Mr. Buer or Mr. Gum on that point.
Thank you.
Mr. Bulkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Am I on? Yeah, okay. Couple of questions, or actually, I option 4, I think when we met before, I mentioned that, you know, there's older houses out there that aren't even going to be close. And that I think option 4 comes closest to what I was thinking about, that it really needs to be around sinks and both in the kitchen and the bathroom. And I think it meets that. I guess I have 2 concerns. One is, and it sounds like the one you've got to beat on, that people do after the fact. I mean, the old GFI breaks or something, because there's mechanical parts to it, and then they replace it with just a regular plug. So it went from being in compliance to not being in compliance. And I assume we see those. I want to make sure that we capture those. I would also point out that Pierce County, we were part of unincorporated Pierce County until 1996, and their level of inspections and of permitting left a little bit to be desired. And I'm a county employee, right? And I understand that maybe it wasn't the best in the world. And in fact, a lot of places that people are living in might even have gone unpermitted. So, I think this is a compromise. Personally, I would have left it to staff. I like what we're doing now, but if I had to choose, I would choose number 4.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to point something out to, or mention something to Mr. Brandstetter. I appreciate your comments, and your comments are something that I thought about. I could find no data to support whether or not the installation of GFIs made a difference. Logic would suggest that it does, but there is nothing that I could find at the sites that I referenced that would support that. Furthermore, I would also point out that the cities of Bellingham, Seattle, and Kent haven't found that evidence either, because those 3 cities do not support what is being proposed here, at least as I read option 4. So that is why I would argue that option 3, along with, as I think Deputy Mayor Whalen pointed out, and I think as City Council or City Heidi pointed out, that if we make it clear that this is the standard, then we are in the clear. But I just want to say I did think about that, Mike, and I found no evidence one way or the other. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And I'd like to indicate I appreciate all the hard work that staff did in ferreting out these options and setting them out so they're somewhat understandable. In answer to one of the earlier questions, I think I was the antagonist who precipitated this getting on the agenda after any number of complaints from rental housing operators who were essentially promised by council that the inspections wouldn't be intrusive, and then came up with a question that I couldn't answer, which is, I have a building that complies with the building code. How can you tell me I have to spend all this money on electrical work? Because option number 3 is consistent with the building code. And we're telling a select group of owners, we have been telling them they have to do something above and beyond the building code. I think that option 3 provides greater compliance with the present day code for new buildings than option 4 does. And staff could correct me if I'm wrong. It may be more difficult to interpret, but as the GFI requirements have ramped up, I think it's going to produce fewer buildings that are there will be fewer inspected buildings that essentially have an exemption from having GFCIs under 3 than there would be under 4. But I'm not entirely confident that that's a correct interpretation. Mr. Bjor, do you have a?
I'm sitting here tallying what I'm hearing from the council members. I have Mr. Brandstetter sounding as if he prefers stay the course, which would be option 1. Paul Boki basically saying the same thing, or he could go with option 4. Mr. Simpson indicating that his preference is option 3, but make a point to the owner that this is what the current code says, you might wish to upgrade. And I hear the mayor asking that we move with option 3. So right now, I don't seem to have a consensus from the council.
Mr. Brandstetter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, Mr. Buer, I'm in favor of either 3 or 4 because they both of them seem to require buildings to actually comply with a standard of a code that is applicable to that building.
Okay.
And Mr. Buer, I should have addressed you directly instead of calling on you after I rambled. My question really is, which results in fewer units that don't require GFIs in the kitchen and bathroom, number 3 or number 4? I would suspect that number 3, because number 4 is a blanket, it may be number 3, but I don't know.
Jeff does these inspections more often than I'm going to defer to Jeff on that one.
This would go back to your earlier question, Mr. Mayor. You were asking when the kitchen GFCIs were instituted under National Electrical Code. That was 1987. So to answer your next question, option number 3 would require fewer kitchens to be updated. Under option 3, if you had a building that was built prior to 1987, they wouldn't be required. 87 on, they would. Option 4 would require all of those units, whether they're constructed in 87 between 87 and 75, those would be required to have kitchen GFCI. So option 4 would be a little more stringent.
Thank you. Mr. Whalen.
I would be fine with either 3 or 4 as an option. 4, I think, being a little bit more stringent makes a bit more sense. Of course, we don't really have data in front of us as to the number of 1975 or newer units or properties that have been inspected to date. You know, I'm concerned with 2 things, regardless of which option we pick. Number one, I think we should make sure that we have the recommendation, the inspection checklist, that if you just happen to be a building prior to 1975, we could still recommend that the owner consider upgrading the property to include a GFCI in the 3 locations that make sense to do so. So I would encourage that. The other thing is, you know, we hear a lot these days about equity and inclusion, and I'm a little concerned about the prior folks who've been stung by this, and they're going to say, does that mean I get a refund? Does that mean, you know, that if you whine loud enough, you don't have to do certain items? Whereas, you know, some people I know, and I think the mayor's heard it as well as I, that some people spend a lot of money on this with large apartment projects, and it's been pricey. So I just encourage us to, while this may certainly provide the correction going forward for those yet to spend the money, we're still likely going to hear some blowback from people who've already spent it. So that said, I'll support 3 or 4, preferably 4.
Mr. Mayor? Mr. Mayor? Mr. Mayor?
Yes, who do we have?
Mary. I think when we discussed this the last time, we looked at number 4. I'm open to either 3 or 4, but since the part that Deputy Mayor Whalen brought up about changing now, how are we going to go forward with the people that have already paid that? So I'm in favor of number 4.
All right. Any further comments, questions?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
I'm redoing my tally. It appears that there is consensus on number 4.
Seems to be the gravitas is going toward 4. Yeah. So bring that back, and if there's a change of heart, we can amend it.
Okay.
Anything further there? I'll find my agenda again.
I think it's helpful to note that I'm not using my blow dryer in the laundry room, so maybe option 4 will save me from myself.
I'm going to probably need a blow dryer as my hair gets longer. Let's see. So my agenda just disappeared. Sorry, folks. So we now move to a review of Community Development Block Grant CARES Act calendar and funding recommendations.
I'll go ahead and start the conversation and Jeff can take it over, but recently the federal government amended its community development block grant program to provide for additional funds in the form of $5 billion to assist with COVID-19. That got translated into funds that then got into the CDBG allocation process. And then an allocation was made for both Tacoma and Lakewood. Lakewood's allocation was about $351,000. We've been working with Tacoma to see if we can't move that forward to provide a program to assist small businesses with cash awards or grants. That is the one thought that we have currently, to see if we can expedite a program. With that, I'll turn the rest of the presentation over to Jeff.
All right. So yeah, I wanted to provide you with a few things. Scheduling of the funding, how the timeline is looking for us and Tacoma to put it together. Give you guys some funding recommendations, and then follow up with a kind of a state of the consolidated plan, because it kind of keys into where we're going with both of these things. So the timeline that we are looking at, it's kind of dictated between our schedule and Tacoma's. Tacoma being the lead entity is the driver of the program. So we're looking to do an amendment to the 2019 annual action plan so we can spend these funds more quickly. The HUD memorandum, they haven't put out very many, but the two that they've put out, their recommendation was to do a 2019 plan amendment. They've loosened up some of the restrictions. They've allowed us to do a 5-day comment period versus a 30-day comment period. They've relaxed the public hearing requirements. We used to have a public hearing. They're allowing us to do a virtual hearing or none if that's not an option. And then they've allowed us to do a few other things a little bit more quickly than we would otherwise have done with CDBG funds. So the calendar moving forward, again, this is after having conversations with Tacoma staff and our staff, trying to figure out how to make this work and get it as quickly and expeditiously out as we can. We're looking at right now up until April 26th, Tacoma and Lakewood are working on our IDIS templates. So inputting just the general information, why we're changing the funding, what we're looking to change it to, and get that set up. We anticipate having that done within the next week and a half. No later than April 24th, we would have to, well, sorry, we were, based on that schedule, we'd be looking to have an April 27th to May 1st 5-day comment period. So the April 27th comment period would require us to provide HUD with a notification no later than April 24th. It's a 2-day notification that we're going to do a 5-day comment period instead of a 30-day comment period. So there's some official notification. HUD then grants us the waiver and we move forward. So after the May 1st 5-day public comment period, we would be bringing it back to council on May 4th for your review and approval. Tacoma would be looking to take it to council on May 5th for their review and approval, and then submission thereafter on May 5th or May 6th to HUD, and then enacting these funds into action. So what we were looking to do is the important thing here with CDBG funding and the CARES funding is to remember that there's a couple of different programs. CDBG, the CARES, as Dave mentioned, is about $351,000. We would be we'd be recommending a fund for small businesses. And small business is something that we're using as a term here in the city of Lakewood. It's not necessarily a HUD term. HUD would determine a small business, anything under 500 employees. We're calling our small business loan program a small business loan program. It would actually be a micro enterprise loan program under HUD rules. So our program, as proposed, would be a $10,000 grant to businesses to do basically a mediation and mitigation of impacts for losses due to COVID-19. So they could use it for payroll, they could use it for operational expenses, they could use it for business retention, employee business retention. They could create jobs if they so chose. They could use it for any of those things, but they would be a grant to the business specifically relating to effects of COVID-19. The businesses that we would look to assist would have requirements of being a low to moderate, owned by a low to moderate income owner. They would have, again, 5 employees or fewer. The businesses would have to have a physical location, so it wouldn't be an option for a home business to apply for these funds. We also looked at businesses must be located in the city of Lakewood, and they truly have to document that they have a COVID-19 impact upon their business. Getting the program up and running was something that Dave and I looked at, and it wouldn't require a large lift in this case because approximately, I think it was 3 years ago, we had a business loan program. So all of the all of the documentation for qualifications, all of the documentation for applications and underwriting guidelines, all of that have been in place. We have not used them, but the nice thing is we've already got them developed. It would be easy to kind of pivot at this point in time and put those back into play for this program. So it wouldn't require a large lift up front. Some of the things that we've also discussed is how do we implement this program? Being a CDBG staff of 2, Martha Larkin and myself, we would look to enlist help from the Economic Development Department. So Miss Becky Newton would come in and help us with identifying eligible clients. She could suggest 2 businesses do some of the advertising for the program. She could help with that end. She could do all kinds of things to facilitate this program, do a lot of the intakes and get these clients to us, and then we could do the final loan. I call it loan underwriting, but the grant underwriting in this case, and moving the funds to the businesses. The thing that I would caution is with the COVID-19, we don't know the impact of the COVID-19 on our budget. So with the program proposal that we would be proposing is it would not include any staff costs paid out of the general fund. So if Becky Newton was working on the program, her time would be charged directly to the CDBG. So it would not impact the general fund. Any program time that I would have in the program would be charged as well to the program. There could be an allocation set aside depending on how council wanted to set it up. All of the program staff time could be charged to the grant, or we could have a 20% set aside, which would be $70,000 roughly. There is going to be some monitoring ongoing after the loans to make sure that job creation or retention and some of those things are done. So there would be some administration time. If we did not use those funds, they could, 1, be rolled back into the loan program and just be used for loans if we don't use them for staff time, or 2, we could move to reallocate those in next year's award allocation. So that's typically what we've done. But in this case, if it's coming out of the program itself, you could just leave those in the program and they could become loan funds instead of staff time. So the thing that I believe when we presented the last time we were there with the consolidated plan, the number of businesses that would qualify, we refined that a little bit. The numbers were a little bit high, but if you're looking at a $351,000 loan program with $70,000 in staff time, you're left with about $280,000. So if it's a $10,000 program, you could assist 28 businesses. There's also options. I mean, as a council, it's your program. You could choose to raise those funds. You could choose to lower those funds. I mean, as many businesses or as few businesses as you'd want to impact. That's an option. Ultimately, with the CDBG program, you're not necessarily looking at how many businesses you serve. I mean, you're kind of looking at how many people you're impacting. So people that you're impacting could be low, moderate income persons that are retaining a job. It could also be a business themselves. So if you've got a business that's staying open and it's a micro enterprise where the owner's low income, you're impacting the businesses that way as well. So there's a number of ways that this can be accomplished. The other thing that I wanted to kind of update is the consolidated plan, and it kind of ties into the CDBG business loans. So the thing with CDBG and the con plan moving forward is when we brought programs for the consolidated plan before council last week, I believe it was, we were directing all funding towards housing for CDBG. And then we were using home funds for tenant-based rental assistance and some other things. And the tenant-based rental assistance I did hear it was a important thing to focus on elderly senior households for tenant-based rental assistance. So that's something that we're moving forward with that road. The thing that I would like to point out is doing housing with CDBG and focusing on business, enterprise, job development, those types of things with COVID-19 gives us a kind of a safety net. So there's a requirement for CDBG funds never to exceed 1.5 times your current year's allocation. So if we're doing CDBG housing projects, this avenue would allow us another road to spend those funds. So we need to, in essence, keep those funds moving, because what happens with the COVID-19 funding is this year we have an increase in our budget. So we're at another $300,000 plus our, I forget what the number is, $630,000. So we're roughly $900,000. So this year, it isn't much of an impact. Moving forward, when you look at next year's funding and it drops back down again, we're potentially, if you don't move those funds, now you're bumping up against that 1.5% or 1.5 times cap. So it's really important to allocate these funds and move these funds as quickly and as equitably and efficiently as we can. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, again, it's Tacoma is again in the driver's seat for this. They are the lead entity. So we have to work with Tacoma housing staff. They've had some turnover. We've had a number of meetings with them. I'm meeting with them again tomorrow to discuss this specifically, how to get this off the ground and make sure that we're meeting the deadlines and can get these funds out there as quickly as we can. So that's something important. And then once we do decide as a council and as a city where we're going with this, we will come back to you all on May 4th, adopt it as a resolution and move forward. The things that we would recommend adopting on May 4th would, again, you're approving an amendment to the 2019 plan to spend these $351,000. It would also obviously include what the plan is that we're doing, establishing a grant program to microenterprise small businesses in the city of Lakewood. It can be, it's up to you all as a council. You can target whomever you so choose for the businesses. It can be job creation, it can be job retention. There can be a number of things that one can do. I would caution council to leave it open enough where there's a leeway where if one or two avenues don't pan out, there is a different avenue where we can spend funds. So if one were to restrict these funds specifically to job creation for low-income individuals that were developmentally disabled, I'm pulling something out. I mean, that would be very specific, and it would be probably very limiting in how we would be able to get those funds out to the public. So it's important that you leave it open enough where the avenues are wide enough we can move these funds to a number of businesses that would qualify. And the third piece that would be on the May 4th agenda would be something that I just talked to our HUD staff about, one of the memos that came out, I believe today, the 13th. So the thing that we also need to amend is our citizen participation plan for CDBG. Our citizen participation plan is just that. It's how we take our CDBG presentations and allocations and annual action plans and so forth to the public. The thing that we would have to amend is it does not right now allow us to do a virtual process for the allocations. So under the new guidance that HUD came out with today, they were very specific about how you apply the virtual process. What are the requirements? So we would be bringing in the participation plan with those HUD requirements that allow us to do a virtual hearing. We have to have input from citizens at that virtual hearing. And it also would include us posting our annual action plan, consolidated plan, updates, those types of things to our city website and to sites like Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. So it can get out to the public. We used to do libraries in the city building. So obviously we can't put it in those locations. So this would allow us kind of a greater website and online application to get at these documents. So with that, I turn it back to the council.
Thank you, Mr. Wayland.
The question I had was whether we've received any input from the Chamber of Commerce locally as to what they perceive the needs to be for local and other small businesses. It would be nice to actually tailor the program to the needs as we've been educated about them. I can tell you that there are various programs for, as you know, from the SBA on certain size of companies, but I think Lakewood is probably going to suffer the impact at the 10 or fewer employee level. And these are the kinds of loan monies that might best help them. And I guess if that's the impact we receive info from the chamber, then that's validating. If there's other information that we could glean from others that would help us figure out how best to tailor this to meet the greatest need, that would be good too. Have you heard, Mr. Gum, from Linda Smith or anyone else at the chamber? If not, I think we should extend a hand and say, here's a program offering this just, new off the block. What do you think?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Mr. Allen, we can certainly do that. I know that Becky Newton has had multiple conversations with the chamber as well.
Okay,
she and I have been talking about what goes on. I would, however, let the council know that the Lakewood Chamber of Commerce does not represent all of the businesses in Lakewood. They represent a portion of the businesses. And while we can certainly accept their comments, they are not inclusive to the business community overall.
Well, one thing that's a good point, Dave. I think the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber, in conjunction with the EDB, of which the city's a member, has been doing a lot of work in culling the data and having weekly call-in programs and opportunities for people to have teleconferencing with, Derek Kilmer, Denny Heck, and others who are really looking to have their thumb on the pulse of what's going on out there. So there may be some good data to glean countywide from the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber.
Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Gum, could you clarify just a couple of things for me with respect to our options? The discussion was issue grants of $10,000, but could we make that amount up to 10,000 and have it be variable, allowing an applicant to apply for an amount that he can justify having as a COVID-19 impact? Is that both allowable, and is that manageable?
It is allowable. I would recommend, I mean, if you're looking to set it up to is always the nicest thing to do. It does open the program up to how do you equitably determine somebody gets $7,400 versus somebody gets $6,800 based on retaining 2 employees and the other one's retaining 2 employees. And it may end up with some inherent difficult programmatic issues for how do we actually determine who gets what. It may be easier just to come up with a dollar amount. There isn't anything in the rules and regulations that would preclude you from providing up to amounts. What I would say, if you do that, then maybe you have some benchmarks at certain levels where if you get to 2 employees, it's $7,500. And if you get to X number of employee, or 1 employee could be 75, whatever those benchmarks are, I would say put some intermediate benchmarks in place.
If I can also,
I think the nuances are difficult to evaluate. Easier for the business owner to evaluate, so that if a business owner asks for 7,500, that would be a benchmark, as opposed to, we may not get everybody that asks for 10,000 if we allow the application process for a business owner to make a request. I don't know if you could think about that. Secondly, the number that was mentioned in terms of eligibility had to do, and number that was mentioned for a micro enterprise was 5 or fewer employees. I know that Pierce County, as they did a program similar to this for the unincorporated portion of the county, used a 10 or fewer employee standard. And I kind of think that we end up with a greater likelihood of making sure we can get all these funds committed if we use a 10 or fewer standard. if that makes some, makes some sense. And my other question is, when you say 5 or fewer employees, does the owner count? In other words, if you have a business where there's only an owner, is that become eligible under that standard? Or is there an owner with 5 employees, would they be eligible if we said 5 or fewer?
For HUD, the owner counts and doesn't count. I mean, if there are no employees, then you can qualify because you're a low-income owner. If you're looking at number of employees in the business, the owner wouldn't count as an employee. So it would be the owner, and then he could have 5 employees on top of it. So
I guess I would be looking, when you bring this back to us, I'd be looking for a recommendation as to whether we're going to open this up for grants of $10,000 to someone who is self-employed and has no employees. I'm not sure that I'm fully in favor of that, but I'd like to get a recommendation for it to do that. Okay. That's all that I have. Thank you.
Mr. Whalen.
Yeah, just one more thought here. As a owner of a small business that's applied for the SBA payroll protection program loan myself for our employees, I think there may be some need for gap filler money, which is what this program might be able to do, because the payroll protection program is out there for any number of small businesses to apply to, gain funding, assuming the funding hasn't run out and it won't be replenished, which I think it will. So I don't know how we can factor that in, because there may be other opportunities for these funds outside of payroll that would be helpful for a small business to utilize. That may be a criterion, that if the business has applied for and obtained payroll protection plan or program monies, that these funds have to be used for something else, like maybe rent, maybe utility expenses, those other types of business expenses that you have to kind of keep going other than payroll. Or if they've applied for the payroll program and they haven't yet received the monies, this might be a stopgap measure for certainly the smaller of the companies that might work for them. Mr. Buer.
My intention was always for these funds to be used for gaps.
Right.
The idea behind it is to get a cash infusion to small businesses so that they can survive.
Exactly.
And if they wish to go ahead and apply for PPE funds, that's great. But in the meantime, while they wait, it would be nice to have a cash infusion to keep things going. So from our perspective, from Jeff and myself, it is to try to keep the program simple and to see if we can't get awards as quickly as possible to businesses. Now, I will also state to you, I do not know when we are going to get these funds from HUD.
Right.
But I would like to be able to have a program up and running so that we can assist people as quickly as possible.
I'm all for that.
So I too view this as a gap thing. I'm actually interested in whether, I'll tell you about the county program because I helped design that. That's a loan program as a gap. It's 10 or fewer employees, $2,000 per employee up to $10,000. So the eligibility is based on how many people you show on a form that you paid payroll tax for. Very simple validation or verification, low barrier. It's a no interest 1-year loan. You provide the bare documentation. The advantage to the loan is that it is somewhat self-regulating if there's an expectation that it has to be paid back, even though it's no interest and no credit. And opening something up opening something up as free money can start a tidal wave and then requires additional administrative expense and effort in regulating it. And the idea is that that gets you this gap, or helps in the gap until the federal program, which is forgivable, kicks in. And it can also be made forgivable after the fact. Also, kind of like the NSP program, it has a potential for bringing money back in, so it's reused. So in any event, I'm in favor of going up to 10 employees. I think there are a lot of restaurants, for example, that are small family-run businesses that might have 6 or 7 employees that are still kind of micro enterprises. And I think we want to cast a little wider net for eligibility. And I don't know, Mr. Gum, if and I can just say the documentation on it's pretty simple. You sign a note that is a no interest 1 year, no payment loan, just one balloon payment. And you sign an affidavit saying the stuff I gave you is true. I really need the money because this COVID deal's kicked me in the groin. So I don't know if you have looked into any possibility of a loan program.
Either way, we used to do a business loan program, so the documents are there for the loan program. It's like you say, it's a fairly simple promissory note. It's a fairly simple deed if we go that route. I mean, you could do a signature loan. It's a $2,000 loan per employee. You could do a signature loan. You could do a secured loan, however you wanted to do it. What I would say is, I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter how many employees from a HUD perspective the business is. I mean, that's something that you guys can set. It could be up to 10 employees. It could be up to 100 employees. The reason behind our micro enterprise with the 5 employee max, that's an easy program to implement for HUD because it's a low income owner program. So the documentation is the business owner themselves documenting that they're low income. So they can retain jobs or they can retain their business in essence as a low income owner. So it's the reason that we went with that was just an easy documentation. If you go beyond that, then it's just a job retention, which in this case, if you're looking at impacts of COVID-19, job retention is going to be across the board, easy to document for all these businesses impacted, no matter how many employees we're looking to benefit.
Ms. Farmer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also prefer 10 employees or fewer. I do think, as has already been said, that would cast a bit of a wider net, particularly for some businesses that I'm thinking of. I do prefer grants versus loans. A lot of these folks are already 1 or 2 months away from having to go under anyway. And so having one more thing that they would have to pay back, I believe would be more difficult than it's just one more thing. I do have a couple of questions. Would this be first come, first serve? I imagine you might have more people, more businesses than you can actually serve.
From my perspective, it would have to be first come, first serve, because I think once the applications are out and the information is available, it's going to be very, very popular and we will expend the funds very quickly. So the idea would be to have first come, first serve, and then we would work with individuals to make sure that their applications are complete and let them move forward. We would not kick people out because they had an incomplete application.
Okay. My second question is there absolutely no other alternative to about the 20% of overhead that you're anticipating? It just feels very uncomfortable to be spending any of this on overhead. We're going to take a hit across the board. So we're going to be losing out on something. And I have a really hard time with not spending all of this.
I'm going to try to answer that question and Jeff can intercede if I say it wrong. You have 2 approaches. One is to say, okay, here's the amount. We're going to take a 20% cut and that's going to be our admin costs. That's not what we want to do. What we want to do is actually take each application and work with the individual and take our admin costs there. The intent would be that we would spend less than 20% and then we can reprogram those funds next year. Did I say that right, Jeff?
Yeah, and to follow up, what I would say is what affects the administration of a program is the number of restrictions in essence. So HUD has a number of restrictions, and then depending on how you as a council amend or change a program, obviously you can add your own restrictions internally. So the more things that we add to it, the more hoops that we have to jump through. Obviously, the more difficult it will be to administer. So that's something to be cognizant of.
My only concern with reprogramming the funds next year is that might be too late for some of these folks.
Yeah, and that's why Dave's approach that we were talking, if you leave the funds in the grant program, we do it for major home repair in essence. So you have a loan fund that is out there to be loaned to individuals, and then we use staff time to prepare those loans and get them out there. So it's realistically, the numbers are going to be less than 20%. We typically don't ever hit the 20% admin cap. I don't believe we've never hit the admin cap. So it's usually fractionally less than that, 12 to 18%, depending on how difficult things are to monitor and follow through. So if it's in the program itself, then you wouldn't have to reallocate it. It's just there and you can use it for loans.
The other thing too that we can take a look at is if we go through one cycle and we haven't used all of our admin costs, we have a sufficient amount of money for another round, or HUD comes back in with some additional funds, we could come back in for another 2019 AAP, annual action plan, and reprogram it faster. That's a thought too. But again, right now it's just getting the program up and operating. And my biggest concern, and Jeff is kind of understating it, is getting Tacoma in a position where they can move forward, because right now they lack administrative ability to get into their IDIS system. And that's a big problem, not only for them, but for us. So, you know, getting Tacoma straight is a major part of this whole program right now so that we can move forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Gum, Mr. Viewer, I guess that I would just say that my concern about first come, first serve is that it somehow needs to be accompanied by some real outreach to the business communities that are not English as a first language, because the very first people that we'll get to are the businesses that have a bit more savvy or a clearer understanding of the first announcement, or that have some organization such as the chamber or an attorney or someone that's out there combing for them to find options. And some of the true micro enterprises that we have in our minority communities might not be so nimble if we don't have some way of, before we open it up for applications, having a sufficient time for the information to get to everybody.
I share the concern, Mr. Branstetter. That is an inherent problem with first come, first serve. And that's why we spent some time trying to identify where these low income or moderate income businesses might be located. So that if we did do any kind of outreach, we would try to focus it on where we think those businesses are.
Thank you.
I believe there's also some lead time into, like you mentioned, the program. So we would have to develop the program, advertise it, get it out there. It wouldn't be opened immediately. You're going to have to let all the businesses know, give everybody equal opportunity. For HUD, there's a real big push for minority and women-owned enterprises. So if you're doing this, that's something that they would want to make sure that they're given equal opportunity to participate in.
So could we develop a system for anticipating that it's going to be oversubscribed? For example, say, okay, on May 5th, just pick the number out of there. May 5th, the application's going to open up. We advertise it before then. The applications will be open for a week or whatever it is. And then if it's oversubscribed, either ratcheting it down on the maximum loan amount or pulling them by lot. So those people who have, you give people advance notice, you open up more applications, and then they have an equal chance.
Seattle's actually had this problem. So what they've been doing is they've been improving it in lots, Mr. Mayor. And so, we are internally, we're having some discussions about right now about the oversubscription rate based upon a grant. We haven't got all the answers yet, but we are trying to anticipate those kinds of issues.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you, both of you and Mr. Gum. Get Tacoma moving. You seem to be able to do everything else with the CDBG bureaucracy, so it's a new task.
Well, and I think getting the word out that we're all on board for doing something helpful is a good thing.
All right. So now I believe move to reports by the city manager. I keep losing my agenda over here.
Well, good evening, Mayor and Council. A few updates for you. I want to start off with a COVID-19 update. So it seems that the new term that came out earlier today is that we could be at the end of the beginning as it relates to this virus and the test that it has on our nation and our region and our city. The latest numbers nationally are that over 568,000 folks have been diagnosed with the virus, and there have been over 23,000 deaths. Here in Washington State, we recently passed the threshold of 10,000 people being infected with over 500 who have passed. And within Pierce County, we're very quickly approaching 1,000 people. We're at 969 people in the county who have been diagnosed with COVID-19. And we have 20 who have passed away in the county, which comparatively speaking is actually a relatively low number. Specifically in Lakewood, there are 75 confirmed cases and 3 deaths. One of the things I think everybody in the health industry is pointing out is that these are probably, really low number, or they're lower numbers than actually what's going on out there, particularly in terms of people who are infected and who might have it. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, there's not a very quick way to get tested. There's a delay. One of the things I do want to report as of today, no city employee has been diagnosed with COVID-19. We have had a handful of employees who have been tested and they came back negative, and we currently have 1 employee who went home sick the other day, and we're waiting on his results here in the next couple of days or so. But again, to date, no City of Lakewood employees have tested positive. One of the other interesting bits of data here in Washington State, and I think this goes to show that Governor Inslee's, stay home, stay healthy initiative is perhaps working, is that the hospitals are actually only using about 25% of the available beds statewide. Now, within the ICU, that's a little bit higher, but we're certainly nowhere near what's happening back on the East Coast. As a matter of fact, the military came in and set up a hospital and was looking to set up other medical facilities, and very quickly they left the state for others. And at this point in time, there's no plan for those additional resources coming, because quite frankly, they're not needed at this point in time. One of the things I reported last week was, that the jails are no longer, accepting folks. They have very, very strict restrictions in place. So unless it's a homicide or a domestic violence or a real serious DUI and some assaults, basically folks that we would have in the past, arrested and brought to jail are being issued citations and being released. One of the things that we learned in the last couple of days is, you might have seen this in the news, is the Washington Supreme Court issued a directive for the governor to address the COVID-19 cases in our state's penitentiary. And what we learned earlier this morning was that perhaps the state was going to be releasing about 950 individuals from the various state penitentiaries. These are nonviolent folks who are expected to be released in the next 60 to 75 days anyways. But one of the concerns we have is that how quickly they're going to release them, because when somebody's released from prison, they go through a individual release plan in terms of, you know, where they're going to go, under what conditions they're going to be as it relates to parole or oversight by Department of Corrections and things like that. So right now, our police chief, Mike Zara, was following up with Department of Corrections to try and get some information on that, specifically as it relates to Lakewood, but also statewide in terms of what Department of Corrections is going to be doing in the near future. And of course, one of the concerns we have is that if they are going to be releasing folks, given that they have had outbreaks of COVID-19 in the penitentiaries, particularly up in Monroe, please don't release anybody who has tested positive for the virus. And I know I'm stating the obvious there, but it is something that we want to make sure. At the national front, Congress late last week introduced a bill, 6467 on the House side, that would provide significant funds.
Mr. Caulfield, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
You're breaking up.
Am I breaking up? Hello?
I hear you pretty loudly, John.
You
I
good?
can hear you loud and clear.
You're pretty clear to me, John.
Mary's good. Mayor, you good? Don?
Now I can hear you.
Am I good? Yeah, your picture's coming in and out. It's freezing up.
Okay.
But everybody else is waving, including the city attorney, which I don't get very often from her. Can you hear me okay, Mayor? I'm going to give him a second, maybe get reconnected.
There you go.
Okay. Well, Congress introduced significant legislation that would be made available to local agencies, including cities with populations under 500,000. And the bill that was introduced would provide $250 billion to local agencies. We have been doing some research on this and talking with our federal delegation and their offices. And it looks like right now that about $100 billion would actually be made available for backfill for revenue lost, as well as incurred costs to cities under 500,000. That's pretty significant. If you do a per capita analysis based on 325 million people in the United States, the city of Lakewood could potentially be getting, $18 million or $14 million or something. I don't think that's what it's going to be. But the good news is that Congress is moving forward with a bill recognizing the financial impacts that we're going to have at the local level. And that's something that we have been in constant contact with our federal delegation the last couple of weeks on. In addition, the general language in terms of what would qualify, we really, really like. And so we're going to continue to advocate this at both the local and at the Washington, D.C. level. So hopefully this is something that will be included in the next economic stimulus bill that Congress considers. So again, some good news there. The other COVID-19 updates I have is that, last week we did pull our incident management team at the city level out of the Pierce County's EOC. There really wasn't a reason to have them there anymore. They're kind of on autopilot. But again, having boots on the ground is not necessary at this time. However, we are in regular and ongoing communication with them. In addition, the Pierce County Department of Emergency Management is in the process of creating an economic recovery task force. In terms of what they're focusing on is to be determined. However, we have allocated resources. Our economic development manager, Becky Newton, as well as our planning manager for special projects, Tiffany Spear, have been assigned to that. Getting away from COVID-19 a little bit, unfortunately, we've had to postpone Parks Appreciation Day, which was going to be 2 weeks from this Saturday on 25 April. And what we're looking at doing is maybe merging that into our annual Make a Difference Day at Fort Steilacoom Park, which is scheduled for October 24th. The draft legacy plan, so that's going to come before you. This has been we've been working on the legacy plan now for over a year. I know the council's received a number of briefings on that. We now have a draft that we'll be bringing forward to you as part of your April 27 study session, so 2 weeks from tonight. We have downloaded that on your iPad so that you have time to go through that in advance of that meeting. We are on a timeline here that plan needs to be adopted by you, the mayor, and the council no later than May 31st. And then that will allow us to apply for grants as part of the next state biennial budget process that you heard about earlier this evening from our legislative team. And we have set aside, again, 2 weeks from today, but also if you need another study session, we have May 11th, but then we have it tentatively, docketed for your regular meeting on May 18th for council to consider and hopefully take action. And then again, that will then allow us to apply for the next round of grants in support of park projects at the state level that then the state legislature will consider as part of their next biennial budget process, which kicks off in January. Western State Hospital, we continue to have conversations with them regarding their master facilities plan. They did make a submittal. We did identify some issues. They are expected to resubmit an updated draft here in the next couple of weeks. One of the things we did let them know is, given that this has to go before the hearing examiner, if this stay at home, stay healthy initiative is in place, that's probably going to have to be bumped out a little bit. They weren't happy to hear that, but it is the world that we live in. My preference right now is not to do that via virtual process, just given the scope of that plan. But again, by the time they have a plan ready to present, this could all be moot anyways. One of the things they did inquire about was whether or not they could move forward with getting permits to demolish some of the 5 old houses that the military built back in the day along Stilican Boulevard. They're outside, they're kind of right up along Stilican Boulevard there. We told them, no, we would prefer you don't do that you include that as part of your master facilities plan to ensure that the public and the community have feedback and input on that. And so that's where we stand on that. Also at your next study session, it's kind of tentative at this point in time, highly likely, but we did receive our first small wireless facility franchise application, which is those antennas that these telecommunication companies want to put up for 5G. And that's the new emerging technology. It was received on March 30th. So we are on the proverbial clock as identified by federal and state statute, as well as our own code, which we're required to abide by the federal and state statutes. It's from AT&T. However, we have also recently been pinged by Verizon that they have an interest in submitting as well. So again, right now we're on a timeline to bring forward that draft franchise for your review as part of your April 27th study session. The census, our planning manager for special projects, Tiffany Spears, serving lead on that. She had a conference call last week with the Pierce County Auditor, Julie Anderson, who's kind of heading things up countywide. Actually, she's doing a really good job on this as well. I think as of last week, nationally, the response rate is 46.2%. Washington State is exceeding that at about 52%. The county is at 51%. And while we're exceeding the national average, we're lagging behind both state and county at about 47%, and kind of in the middle of the pack of all the cities. So we do have some work to do. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, the in-person outreach that the Census Bureau had planned on doing with a number of individuals is currently on hold, is on pause. So one of the things that we're going to do here in Lakewood, but also I know the county is doing in other cities, is we're going to print out some postcards and we're going to mail them out to the community with a focus on areas that we haven't seen, a significant response. And we have also reached out to our municipal partners about having them put in their various communication devices, whether it's their newsletter or webpage or social media, about the importance about undertaking and participating in the census for 2020. So we're trying to stay out ahead of that. And then the last update that I have is I had a conversation last week with the library executive director. The libraries as a whole, they're all closed. However, they are really ramping up their ability to provide more ebooks and audiobooks sooner rather than later. And then the other bit of conversation that we had was in regards to their planning process. They are interested in bringing new libraries, not just to Lakewood, but Sumner. And they had been going through the request for qualification process to secure the services to move to the next phase of community outreach. But because of COVID-19, that is on pause because they can't really do any community outreach at this point in time. So that's on pause, and they will re-engage, and we will re-engage with them once this current crisis is over, which hopefully will be sometime later this summer, if not sooner. Actually, I'm sorry, the last update I have, development services. While the number of inspections that we get on a daily basis is anywhere from 1 to 4 or 5 at the max, and to put that in perspective, we typically average anywhere between 20 and 25. So really inspections are way down. However, our general permitting activity in terms of folks coming in and wanting to get permits and applications for development continues to happen. We're really not seeing a bit of a slowdown. What we're hearing from folks, primarily from larger developers, is they want to be ready to go once they can get back to work once again this crisis is over. So our team is continuing to process permits and applications and things along those lines. So with that, Mayor, that's my report.
Thank you. Any questions from Mr. Caulfield? Well, hearing none, we will move to council comments. And the first item of business is for everybody to turn their mics on. And we're going to sing happy birthday to Councilmember Farmer.
Somebody's got to start off.
Yeah.
Come on, turn your mics on, guys. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, dear Linda. Happy birthday to you.
Yay!
And
Thank you.
here, if you can switch to my camera, I have some virtual ice cream for you.
I'm virtually, it's very tasty. Thank you. Virtual calories are my favorite.
Yeah.
So we'll kick off council comments with Ms. Farmer in honor of her birthday.
Oh gosh.
All right.
Thank you. I wanted to mention that I believe the census will officially be postponed or wrapped up later in the fall. They're not, given everything that COVID is doing and not being able to engage in field operations, they're working to figure out a way to move around that. I think it's important for us not to let up the fight and getting the word out. So postcards and as much as we can share on social and trying to do our best, I think is incredibly important with redistricting right around the corner as our legislative folks mentioned. I don't have a heck of a lot to report. Just that I have been contacted by a company that does accessory dwelling units, ADUs, and I'm interested in learning more. And given our legislative report and some of the things that happened at the legislature this year, I will have more that I can share with you later. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bulkey.
Hey, real quick, very excited to see construction starting on Onyx Drive, but also waiting for the shoe to drop when they start. I went out there today and they have not started cutting the trees down yet. So when the trees start going down here in the next few days, you'll be aware that you will probably get some kind of messages from some folks. But they are getting ready. They are prepping.
All right, Mr. Sim.
Nothing here, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Whalen.
Nothing for me.
Ms.
All
Moss.
I do is work.
Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's good to see that we are all still kicking. We followed the rules and we stayed safe, so it's good to see everybody's still well. I wanted to, as I was reading through our legislature, our government relations report today, I realized how much work that our team is doing for us in Lakewood. And then to hear their reports tonight, it's a lot of work going on. And normally we invite them to our office and have refreshments and visit with them face to face. So I would suggest that in the meantime, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, that we send a letter now thanking them for their work and invite them to our office at a later time to celebrate face to face. Just a suggestion. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Branstetter.
Hey, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple things to report about South Sound 911. The new executive director is been there a week. She's scheduled to visit the Lakewood City Hall Friday of next week to both have a meeting and also see where South Sound 911 meets to do that. And that the new Public Safety Communications Center on Pacific Avenue, construction has been ongoing and it's now deemed to be 35% complete and on budget. On May 5th, the Tacoma City Council is holding a public hearing. That's an odd day because it's right after May 4th. But the hearing is on the another extension of the interim tide flats development rules. That's been something that over the past year, every time there's been a hearing, I've gone and testified for the city, and I have no idea whether the extension of the rules this time has got any behind the scenes efforts to make any changes, but John or Mayor, if we could have some feelers out there, that is there something we need to make sure that we say at that hearing other than don't change them or do away with them entirely. But that's set for May 5th. I agree with Councilmember Farmer that the completion of the census is going to be delayed and put off by efforts at the national level because it's a national project. And while we in Washington State might see a window of time of where we can get it done, I think other parts of the country may not see that same window to be able to do it, and we be going on. Then Mr. Mayor, you had a letter that you were considering sending to the governor. You want to address that in your comments so we can give you feedback on it?
Yes.
Okay, and then that's all I have.
With respect to the tide flats issue, if the governor's proclamation is extended, then no action other than continuing it would be allowed under the modification of the Open Public Meetings Act. So we'll just have to do a wait and see on that. With respect to the letter, I call that essentially a Me Too letter, and looking for a consensus of the council. I'd like to send a letter on my behalf and behalf of the city saying that we support reopening of residential construction. The contractors, in addition to that being essential, we have a huge housing shortage. It's the definition of essential. They're suffering significant losses because of projects that are sitting there vacant, while other things get to go on that don't seem nearly as vital. We're one of the only states that's restricting residential construction. And if you, for example, if your construction is tied to an essential function under the governor's order, you can do that construction. So if you are a public project, by definition, yes. If you have a medical office in the commercial building that you're building, you can proceed because that's a medical office is an essential function. It will be there someday. Or if you're doing an addition to a pot shop, because it's being deemed an essential function, you can complete that project, but you can't complete a house that's 80% built. So I would like to add our voice to the many that are encouraging the governor to reopen residential construction and invite your feedback. Mr. Brandstetter.
Mr. Mayor, I understand the reason why the governor might have, back when he made his initial proclamation, included construction of all sorts as allowed. But I just personally, wouldn't want to send a letter at this time advocating for a change in those restrictions that have been there and ongoing, because I am concerned that if we begin to advocate for that, then we're going to get a lot of other things that will come forward, and particularly as news starts to get better and people see, well, they're opening up new things to be able to be considered essential, that then we're going to get less commitment to adhering to the stay home, stay healthy moves, as that seemed to be not so firm of a directive. So it just would be my preference to not send the letter on behalf of the city.
Any other thoughts? Mr. Whalen.
Well, I'm one who would advocate sending the letter because we wouldn't be the first in a long line of cities and counties that have done so. I think the residential construction world, as well as the commercial construction world, is one where the contractors can manage and follow strict guidelines and still do some work and move the ball forward. Otherwise, we're going to be way behind the 8 ball here when we come out of this thing, hopefully no later than mid-May. So I'd be okay with it.
So I understand that policy talks have actually already begun on this issue at a fairly high level. So the conversation is happening, and I would support us sending a letter if the tenor of our letter was changed slightly to be more of a, let's do this as soon as it's safe to do so. Right now, the supply chain of PPE for construction is a big deal because PPE is going to the front lines, the medical, the long-term care facilities. It is going to those places that are, super essential. So they haven't quite figured out how to get around the PPE for construction. But I do know that there's interest in doing that as quickly as possible and as safe as possible. And I'm happy to follow up offline on any wording.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mayor. I understand what Mike and Linda are saying, but I think here maybe sooner is a little better than later. And I would favor sending the letter pretty much as is now, just to get the ball rolling. Because if we are going to turn this economy around, if we're going to reignite or restart the economy in Washington, and particularly for Lakewood, we need to put that bug in the ear of the governor now rather than later. Thank you.
Here.
Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm in favor of sending the letter.
And Mr. Mayor, you can register me as being in favor. It sounds like they're in discussions, and he's the governor's held pretty firm on this. So I think it's a good idea to come in on the side of, hey, let's get something done. And I'm fine with the letter, and let's go forward with it.
I would note that the county executive and I actually had county executive leading and Mike chiming in a discussion with the governor when he was here at the Nourish food warehouse. And he waffled a little bit, but I think he needs a bigger push. So we would probably be about the 20th. So I think with this guidance, I will shorten the letter that was mainly staff drafted and make it a little more conciliatory and go ahead and send it. Is there anything else to come before the council?
Mayor, just, real quick, Councilmember Moss. Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Moss suggested following up in writing with our state legislators. Is the council okay with that? And then also including in there that we would welcome them to come meet with us as you normally do once this current situation is over. Good with that? Yes, thumbs up. All right, thank you.
I think that's a great idea. Send them some virtual snacks at the same time. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I'm going to do that for Deputy Mayor Whalen for forever. That's a great idea, Mayor. Thank you. You just helped me out.
All right. With that, we're adjourned.
All right.
See you next week.
Take care. Thank you.
Good night.
Happy birthday, Linda.
Yes, happy birthday.
Thanks so much, guys.
Hmm.